the GOP. Harding on to victory.
Al Smith nominated for president, my darling. Al Smith nominated for president. My vote to him I'm gonna present, my darling.
Why not take all of me?
Prohibition is a failure, as anyone can see. For whiskey is sold in every town in the good old USA.
Hello everyone and welcome to your video lesson on the Roaring 20s. So don't forget, since I am not at school today, you are going to have a quiz on Friday on this video lesson and on the guided notes that you are taking along with the video lesson. So please make sure that you are paying attention, watching the video, and it would be extremely helpful, I would argue borderline completely necessary, to follow along with the Google Slides that I have posted on the Roaring 20s, going along with this video on its learning. As I teach you this lesson, I'm following from the Roaring 20s Google Slides. So it would be very, very helpful for you to follow along with it. So remember, the essential question is, America is now coming out of World War I. What comes next? What happens after you fight the largest war in human history? And the answer for Americans is, like, go back to normal. Just do what we were doing before. And there's going to be a candidate running in 1920 on the promise of a return to normalcy. His name is going to be Warren Harding, and he becomes president in 1920. And the return to normalcy is going to kind of be the defining phrase for this decade. But in reality, America really can't ever go back to normal. America before World War I and America after World War I are two totally different places. So what you're going to see is sort of a tug of war between the old way of doing things, the pre-mega prosperity World War I, and then the mega prosperity post-World War I America. And that tug of war is going to take three forms: political, social, and economic. Now, we're mostly going to discuss political and social today. We will touch a little bit on the economic, but I want to make sure that I save that for our stock market simulation on Friday. So we're going to start off with the political changes, the parts that aren't quite as flashy as the Roaring 20s, what you probably know it for, the Great Gatsby stuff. The political changes are going to be massive though, and it's something that we need to spend some time on. First up, like I said, you've got the election of Warren Harding. Warren Harding is not a terribly exciting president. Like many presidents who are elected, he is elected because he's better than the alternatives, and people aren't really thrilled about anybody else. So Warren Harding, the nice scoop of vanilla ice cream, becomes president. I don't think he ever placed more than like 4th or 5th in a primary, but he actually wins it at the convention for the Republican nomination. He defeats in the general election a guy named James Cox and a famous vice presidential candidate, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who would have been the VP for James Cox. Don't feel too bad for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. I think his political career is going to be fine, but he does lose in this one. So Warren Harding and his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, become president and vice president respectively. But don't forget, of course, Eugene Debs does run in the election of 1920 from prison and collects 900,000 votes while he's there, which is pretty impressive. Actually, the 1920 election is the first election in which women can vote, marking a major turning point in American politics, and it's a big reason why Warren Harding wins. So in general, remember, what people are voting for is the return to normalcy. They're kind of tired of that Wilson-esque idealism of making the world safe for democracy and this borderline world police state that Woodrow Wilson's interested in making as he tries to make life better for the world, yes, but also seemingly involve America in every world problem. Remember that America is returning to isolationism because the Congress and the Senate, they say no. They say absolutely not to Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations. The League of Nations post-World War I does form. It's going to be kind of like a UN, but it has no bite. It doesn't have any power. And America doesn't join it. Remember that America returns to isolationism and does not join Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations, even though it was their president's idea. Warren Harding's presidency is not going to be much to write home about. Mostly he's famous for that return to normalcy line. There are a couple of issues that happen while he's in office, though. The Teapot Dome scandal, in which a cabinet member of his leased oil fields to private companies in return for a $100,000 bribe. Also, Warren Harding will be president once prohibition has already taken hold. And his attorney general is forced to resign due to illegal sales of liquor permits. Also, there's corruption in his cabinet. Warren Harding is actually going to die in 1923, and he'll be succeeded by Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge is famously known as Silent Cal. He's not an exciting guy at all. Calvin Coolidge is going to run for he'll finish out Harding's term. He'll run for re-election once, but declines infamously to run for re-election again. A lot of people think it's because he might have known the Great Depression or the stock market crash, and then the Great Depression was coming, but we'll get there. So the 1920s are going to be the time of the first Red Scare. The much more famous Red Scare is going to happen in the 1950s with a senator named McCarthy, but we'll get to him. So the Red Scare is going to be a fear of communists, socialists, anarchists, following a series of anarchist bombings in 1919. Of course, the Red Scare is mostly a reaction to the Russian Revolution in 1917, in which communists took over Russia. A. Mitchell Palmer in America is going to coordinate raids on homes of suspected radicals and headquarters of radical organizations across the U.S. These are famously going to be known as the Palmer Raids. The unions of this time are going to be targeted as potential communist organizations, leftist organizations. And then also criminal syndicalism laws made it illegal to advocate violence to secure social change. And then there's also the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, in which two anarchist Italian immigrants convicted of robbery and murder based on who they were in their Italian lineage rather than evidence. But then, of course, let's take a look at labor. Remember, labor has made massive gains since the 1800s. The early 1900s are a time of huge moving forward for the labor movement. The government had been really friendly to labor during World War I. They really needed that labor production with the War Labor Board. But in 1919, steel strikers are going to get branded as Reds, communists. And so there's also going to be a federal injunction in 1922 breaking up a rail strike. Union membership is going to drop 30% between 1920 and 1930. So business is going to be booming in the 1920s, but unions are not. There's also going to be an Immigration Quota Act of 1924. The quota for immigrants entering the U.S. was set at 2% of the total of any given nation's residents in the U.S. as reported by the 1890 census. This is going to target the undesirable immigrants most associated with maybe radicalism and communism. So essentially there's going to be a cap put on the number of immigrants. Also at this time, you get the rise of the new KKK. The KKK are going to form in the Reconstruction era, the original KKK, but then another brand, a new uprising of the KKK is going to happen in the 1920s. It is going to be anti-foreign, anti-Catholic, anti-black, anti-Jewish, anti-pacifist, anti-communist, anti-internationalist, anti-revolutionist, anti-bootlegger for prohibition, anti-gambling, anti-adultery. The KKK is going to stand against a lot of things. At its peak in the 1920s, it claimed 5 million members, mostly from the South. At this time, the first full-length feature film in America was D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. This was actually screened in the Woodrow Wilson White House, which is why he's a pretty controversial president to this day. But Birth of a Nation is famous for being an extremely high-budget movie. It's one of the first what we would call like modern movies, but it is about the rise of the KKK. And it paints the KKK in a very heroic light. And then to sort of tie a bow on the political side of things, you've got the Scopes trial, also known as the Scopes monkey trial. This is a trial over the teaching of evolution, and it shows the conflict, the growing conflict in 1920s America between fundamentalists, what we would call people who are religious, and science. And it was part of a larger trend of traditionalism versus modernism, which you're going to see more of in the social side of things in just a minute. Fundamentalists, people who didn't want the teaching of evolution, argued teaching evolution eroded faith in God and contributed to the overall moral decay of youth during what we call the Jazz Age. The American Civil Liberties Union hired Clarence Darrow, whose cross-examination of William Jennings Bryan made Bryan look foolish and hurt the fundamentalist cause. William Jennings Bryan's still around in the 1920s and part of this Scopes monkey trial. Scopes was found guilty. It was a teacher teaching evolution in Tennessee. He was found guilty and fined because he did violate the Tennessee law banning the teaching of evolution. But what you're going to see is that this is going to be where you start to see the rise of teaching evolution in America. So let's move on to social, perhaps the more fun part of the Roaring Twenties. So participation in World War I is going to transform the U.S. America is going to come out of the war as probably one of the most rich and developed countries in the entire world. There's going to be mass production, high wages, new consumer goods, and forms of entertainment, and that's why it's all going to come to be labeled as the Roaring Twenties. But right away, you're going to see there's conflict in the Roaring Twenties. Conflict, as I mentioned earlier, between modernism and traditionalism. So modernism is a radical break with the past and a concurrent search for new forms of expression. And then there's traditionalism, holding on to traditional values and resisting change. Modernism is going to be what we call like flapper culture and going out and a lot of drinking and things like that. Whereas traditionalism is going to be things more like the Prohibition movement. Let's limit alcohol, temperance. It's also going to look at the old ways of doing things and say essentially those were better. In this time, America's standard of living goes through the roof, and you're going to see the effects of that in the culture. Americans owned at this point like 40% of the world's wealth. The average income goes up 35%, and people have new things to spend their income on, like electric machines, irons, refrigerators, toasters, washing machine, vacuum cleaners, all of these very, very modern things. But since you have those things, you don't have to spend all of your time doing those things that you used to do by hand, and now you've got more time to do things. And a lot of the reason why people had these things is because of advertising. People wanted stuff that this is going to be the birth of what we call like modern advertising. And guess what? Now, in the 1920s America, you don't have to pay for it all at once. You can pay it through what we call installment plans, kind of like paying for things on credit now. It allowed people to buy goods that they couldn't buy before because they couldn't buy it outright. But now you can buy it now, pay for it later. Enjoy while you pay. Keep an eye on that because while that might feel like free money, it is not. Also, Ford's Model T is coming into its own. It's introduced in 1908. By the end of the 1920s, it's a necessity. A lot of people have this car, and America is getting more mobile. They are able to travel a lot more. In popular culture, you've got the newspaper, which is mass circulating. Magazines are rising in circulation. The radio is actually the most powerful, or what we would call the talkie at that time, was the most powerful form of communication. Think of it almost like streaming TV, Snapchat, TikTok. The radio was huge, and that was what families did in the 1920s. You've also got the birth of Babe Ruth,
the Great Bambino.
One of the greatest baseball players ever to live. He becomes a national hero at this time. Also, you get moving pictures. You have the rise of you've even got Mickey Mouse at this time, Steamboat Willie, to tell you how modern things are getting. You've got Charlie Chaplin, the biggest movie star of his age. Silent pictures are still the thing, but very, very quickly you're gonna have talking pictures coming up. And now, women in particular are gonna be the ones who take society in their own hands in the 1920s through flapper culture. And whenever you think of the Roaring Twenties, this is likely what you think about. Flappers. Flappers become a symbol of a free young woman who embraces new fashion and urban attitudes. They wore skirts above the knee. They had shorter hair. They also wore kiss-proof lipstick. So women at this time start to take more autonomy for themselves. Also at this time, women are starting to work more. They're starting to work not just factory jobs, but jobs like nurses, teachers, secretaries, librarians, and social workers. Now, they're not going to get the same treatment. They're not going to get the same wages. And also, the male view that women mostly belonged in their homes doesn't really change at this time, but women are starting to fight back against that. Child labor laws are also going to limit household income. So what's just happened is that you have limited child labor. By taking children out of the workforce, well, women need to get into the workforce in even larger numbers because you don't have those children anymore. Marriages are also starting to shift from something that is probably set up by your parents to actually choosing your spouse. And people are going to start wanting to choose their spouse and date for love rather than out of the convenience of your families arranging it. Cities at this time revolve around the 3 I's: immigrants, industry, and indecency. So the quote is, cities were the place to be, not the place to get away from. You don't have people migrating out to rural areas. Instead, people are moving to the city. Cities are rising in prominence. And also, the small towns are looking at the city saying, goodness gracious, no way. The things that are happening in the city are extremely sinful. And as we look at it, I mean, it's hard to argue with that, because what's happening in the cities, like I said, immigrants, industry, and then indecency. There's a ton of drinking going on in the cities, a ton of debauchery going on in the cities, and that is going to be what this era is known for. Also, famously, you've got the Harlem Renaissance. This is whenever we turn our eyes to African Americans at this time. Remember, the Great Migration of the early 1900s is going to be where a ton of black people leave the South and move up to the North. They're still facing persecution in the South. It's not getting much better. But up North, you've got jobs with the War Industry Board. You can make weapons for World War I, or you can go work in a factory, or you can just, in general, find a better life up North. So this actually leads to clusters of African Americans getting together, particularly in Harlem, leading to the Harlem Renaissance, where a very, very, very famous group of black people, entertainers, writers, performers, get together and say, we need our own culture. We need to produce our own culture. We don't want to be defined by the culture that has defined us before, essentially trying to find our place in white culture. We want to create our own. The Harlem Renaissance is a literary and artistic movement celebrating African American culture. African American ideas, politics, art, literature, and music flourished in Harlem and elsewhere. The politicians of this time, Marcus Garvey. The writers, Claude McKay and Langston Hughes, one of the most famous black writers of all time. Performers, Paul Robeson. This is in what we call the Jazz Age. The dances were things like the Charleston, the Cakewalk, the Black Bottom, the Flea Hop. And these aren't just black dances, these are white dances as well. As America outlaws alcohol, America is turning to speakeasies for the entertainment of jazz bands. And speakeasies are essentially secret bars. We're going to talk more about that here in just a minute when we talk about Prohibition. But they are secret bars where people can go and drink without having to worry about necessarily the police showing up, but a lot of times they did raid these speakeasies. Musicians of the Jazz Age, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, the Cotton Club in Harlem is extremely famous at this time. So, with all of that being said, you're probably wondering, wait, isn't alcohol illegal? Yes. So Prohibition is going to last from roughly 1918 to 1933. You could put 1920 on there as well. So what's going to happen is that instantly the 5th largest industry in America is going to disappear. Whenever the temperance movement, remember the Women's Christian Temperance Union, is going to finally get its goal of alcohol being outlawed, what we would call the dry law, prohibition. The 18th Amendment is going to make alcohol illegal. The 21st Amendment will make alcohol legal again, but we'll get there. So remember that the Prohibition movement does not pop up in 1918. It has been brewing since the early 1800s with temperance movements, the Second Great Awakening, people advocating against alcohol as a moral evil. The Anti-Saloon League has been fighting against the immigrant saloons where, yes, immigrants pooled together to vote and have a community, and they had dinner there and things like that, and they gambled there, but there was also prostitution there. So the saloons were a pretty terrible place to be. And now, finally, this has landed in Prohibition. And of course, let's not forget our girl, Carrie Nation. Carrie Nation, who advocated for the dry law by smashing up bars with her axe. The problem is that by making alcohol illegal, it really doesn't achieve what people think it's going to achieve or hope it's going to achieve. The 18th Amendment is going to ban the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol, but instantly the speakeasy is born. The speakeasy, of course, being an illegal and underground bar. A lot of times it's just hidden. But then also bootlegging becomes a major criminal business. Bootlegging is the illegal smuggling of alcohol. So the Volstead Act is going to provide the enforcement of the 18th Amendment. It's going to create a special task force in the Treasury Department to enforce the 18th Amendment and monitor activity. But organized crime is going to flourish even so. This is where Al Capone comes into play, perhaps one of the most famous criminals in American history. Al Capone headed the Chicago crime family by age 26. He made $60 million per year through his criminal empire. He was very, very willing to kill off his competition. He is credited with 522 gang killings. By the mid-1920s, 19% of America's favored prohibition, that approval rating dropping extremely quickly because they could see that now there's danger all over the place. People are making their own alcohol and it's making them extremely sick. People are getting poisoned by homemade alcohol. Bootleggers in Kentucky and all over the country are making bad alcohol. They're making money off of something that is illegal. You've turned a lot of people into criminals who are trying to make a living. You've also got people rum running from Cuba and places like that coming into America. So this is just not working very well, and the 21st Amendment will overturn prohibition about 15 years after it is passed. Now finally, the economic. We'll do this really quick because I want to save most of this for your lesson on Friday about the stock market. So at this time, America is booming, but that is mostly built on speculation, money that you think could eventually show up or money that you assume will be there but may not necessarily be. So you've got... So stock speculation was rampant as people did what we call buying on the margin. They borrowed large sums of money to invest in the stock market that seemed to have unlimited potential for growth, but you're borrowing money to gamble. That's not a good thing. And remember, at this time, Republicans dominate the 1920s. It's Warren Harding from 1920, then Calvin Coolidge takes over for Warren Harding. After Calvin Coolidge, you're going to get... And then after Calvin Coolidge, you're going to get Herbert Hoover, who will be president until 1932. Remember, Republicans at this time are very famously laissez-faire. Essentially, hands off, let business do what it does, because once you start messing with business, there's really nothing you can do. So there is a bull market, a really good overinflated values on stocks due to speculation, but eventually that's all going to come crashing down. But we'll get there with the stock market simulation on Friday.
Only Jesus